Hi, my name is Chloe.
I'm Emily.
And we're from the ASU Economics Tutoring Center Department. And today we're going to be covering absolute and comparative advantage. I'm first going to do a few examples using output, and then Emily's going to do it in terms of labor hours. Before we continue, I want to remind you to check your notation with your professors, as it may vary from class to class, and we hope you find this helpful.
All right, so now we're going to do another absolute advantage and comparative advantage problem with the cloth and wine in England and Portugal. But this time, we're given our values in labor hours instead of in values of output. It's important to recognize that we're given them in labor hours because the first thing we have to do is calculate a conversion. Because you see, when it tells us that Portugal can make one cloth in 90 hours, or England can make one cloth in 100 hours, we really don't know exactly how much they're producing. So, in order to make it look more like the comparative advantage problems we've had in the past, where we're looking at units of output in our chart, we're going to do a conversion. So assuming we have 1,000 hours to produce the goods, we're going to take our 1,000 hours and divide that by how long it takes to produce, the time it takes to produce 1 unit. And that's going to tell us how many total units that country can produce. And this total units value we're going to use to then find our absolute advantage and comparative advantage, because total units are what we're used to seeing in these charts. So I'm going to go ahead and erase this real quick, and we're going to start calculating. So for England, we had 1,000 hours total. So our numerator is always the same, but it takes us 100 hours to produce cloth. And so that gives us 10 total units. All right, so with their 1,000 hours, England can produce 10 total units. I'm going to switch the color, and we're going to do Portugal now. Using that same formula, 1,000 hours divided by how long does it take Portugal to produce it? 90 hours, which is 10/9, which, if you calculate out, is about equal to 11.11. And this, again, is our total units. So we just found our total units for producing cloth in both England and Portugal. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and put these numbers up here so we can recognize how we are changing our chart. So if it was in units of output, England would be able to create 10 goods, and Portugal would be able to create 11.11 goods. So now we're going to approach this same idea with wine. For England, 1,000 divided by 120. Remember, this is all in hours. And that, when you calculate it out, is about equal to 8.33. And that's total units that England would be able to produce if they were given 1,000 hours. So I'm going to go ahead and transfer that up here, 8.33. All right. And then we're going to approach it with Portugal. 1,000 divided by 80, because it takes them 80 hours to produce 1 unit of the good. And that gives us about 12.5 total units that Portugal could produce. So we're going to bring, let's try to stay with the same color. That brings us about 12.5 total units. So we see these numbers that we have here, 10, 11.11, 8.33, and 12.5. And all we're going to do as we go into the next section of this problem is look at this table in terms of output only. So we already did our conversion between hours. And so moving to this chart, we see that we have our 10, our 11.11, 8.33, and 12.5. But this converted chart is in terms of output. So what we've done here is create a chart that's similar to charts we've seen in the past. So we don't need to worry about labor hours anymore. So just going back to our regular ideas of absolute advantage, that's the idea of who can make more in the country. Well, who can make more cloth? Well, England can make 10. Portugal can make 11.11. Well, which one's more? So we're just comparing numbers. So 11.11. Portugal has the absolute advantage in cloth. So I'm going to circle them. Who has the absolute advantage in wine? Again, we're not dealing with anything too difficult. We're just comparing how much output they can make. Which number is bigger, 8.33 or 12.5? Well, it's 12.5. So, with absolute advantage, Portugal has the absolute advantage in both cloth and wine. However, transferring this problem to asking about comparative advantage, the problem gets a little bit trickier. We're going to start working with ratios. So, for England, they can either make 10 cloth, or if they spend all of their time making wine, they can make 8.33 wine. So what we're looking at here are absolutes. So if England spent all their time making cloth, they could make 10. If they spent all their time making wine, they could make 8.33. So we set these numbers equal because they can spend their time doing either, and this is how the country values them. So if we were to ask ourselves what the opportunity cost is of one cloth in terms of wine, we're going to divide both sides by 10 in order to get one cloth, right? 10 divided by 10 is 1. 8.33 divided by 10 is a little bit more difficult, but it gets us 0.83 wine. So England's opportunity cost of producing one cloth is 0.83 wine. I'm going to label this as opportunity cost. Now, what's Portugal's opportunity cost of producing cloth? They can either produce 11.11 cloth, just going to keep it as C right now, or they can produce 12.5 wine. And this is, again, looking at it in terms of absolutes. They could spend all of their time making cloth or all of their time producing wine. So if we want to look at what the opportunity cost is of one cloth, we divide both sides by 11.11, and that'll give us one cloth to 1.125 wine. So this is their opportunity cost of producing wine. If we round this number down a bit, we'll just look at that as 1.13. So, if we're comparing the opportunity cost of Portugal to make one cloth to the opportunity cost of England to make one cloth, we're comparing this ratio to this ratio. So it's starting to get a little bit messy here, but the idea is who can produce cloth at a smaller opportunity cost. So if England can produce cloth at this opportunity cost of 0.83 wine, they have the comparative advantage because making one cloth, they only give up 0.83 wine. But if Portugal were to do the same, making one cloth, they give up 1.13 wine. Well, that's a lot more. So we want England to be making the cloth because they have a much smaller opportunity cost. If we flip these ratios around, If instead we're finding the comparative advantage of wine, we need to do the ratio the other way around. So, working with England, we have 8.33 wine to 10 cloth, which is the same if we divide by 8.33 on both sides as 1 wine to 1.20 cloth, about. Which means England's opportunity cost of producing 1 wine is 1.20 cloth. So we need to compare this then to the opportunity cost of Portugal of producing wine. So over here, Portugal can produce 12.5 wine, or they can produce 11.11 cloth. I'm running out of room, so I'm just going to put a C here for cloth. But if we divide both sides by 12.5, we get, for 1 wine, Portugal gives up 0.88 cloth. So their opportunity cost of producing 1 wine is 0.88 cloth. So, in order to find out who has the comparative advantage, we just compare these two numbers. So the 1.2 cloth that England gives up compared to the 0.88 cloth that Portugal gives up, well, who gives up less? Portugal. So Portugal has the comparative advantage in making wine. So, approaching this next and final part of the problem, what would the terms of trade be? Terms of trade is just another way of asking what price or what quantity can England or Portugal charge when they're trading goods. So, England is going to be selling cloth. As we see here, that's why it has a little asterisk, and that's because, as we decided earlier, they could make it for a lower price. So, if England is trading 1 cloth, we're going to put this in terms of the least they would be willing to charge and the most that the other country would be able to purchase it for. So the least that they're going to charge is going to be whatever amount it costs them to make it, which is 0.83 wine. While the most England will be able to charge is 1.13 wine, because that's how much Portugal could make that's how much Portugal would have to give up if they were making their own cloth. So obviously, they are not willing to pay more than what they could make it for. So the terms of trade for England making cloth would be between 0.83 wine and 1.13 wine. And we're just remembering that when we're looking at terms of trade, 1 cloth is in terms of how many wine we would be trading it for. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and then do the terms of trade for wine. So we're going to look at this problem the exact same way we looked at the other one. So Portugal had the comparative advantage in wine because they could produce it at a lower opportunity cost. So what's the least they would be willing to sell their wine for? Well, they can make their wine for 0.88 cloth. So they're not willing to allow England to buy it for any less than that because that's how much it costs them to make it. Well, what's the most then that England is willing to buy it for? Well, again, this is going to be the same price that England could make 1 wine for, which was 1.2 cloth. So we write that in here. And we find that the terms of trade for one wine are between 0.88 cloth and 1.2 cloth. All right, so just to sum up the problem, at the beginning we found out that Portugal had the absolute advantage in both cloth and wine. And so it seemed like, at first glance, that England had nothing to trade if Portugal could just make it better. But what determines our trade is not absolute advantage, but rather comparative advantage. And that means that each country will have the comparative advantage in one good. So, because England could produce cloth at a lower opportunity cost than Portugal could, they were trading their cloth, even though they might not have had the absolute advantage at first glance.
All right, so that's all we have for today. If you need any more help, you can come visit us in the Economics Tutoring Center in the BA building on the second floor. But otherwise, have a great day.